Today's May 16th, 2026, and it's currently 8:20 p.m. Today I want to talk a little bit about overthinking. This is something I feel as though has been sabotaging my mind a bit quite recently, and I don't quite know what to make of it or what to actually think about it right now. And I'm not talking about overthinking in terms of just like, thinking about the past or worrying about all the different possible outcomes of something, but more so like the experience of literally just thinking too much and too deep into something. I often find myself in a spiral where I start with a single thought of me like analyzing an event or like a conversation or something that happened in real life or something that's going to happen in real life, and I come up with a conclusion or an ultimatum about that event. And usually it would be good enough to simply take that conclusion or ultimatum and just carry on moving forward with my day because that would be the best use of my energy. But a lot of times I'll actually continue thinking about this thing um, into this like thinking session where I then start analyzing that conclusion itself. So I had an event, I thought about it, I came up with a conclusion, but then I start thinking about that conclusion of itself and what coming up with that conclusion even means for me. So I started thinking about like what that conclusion means in the context of who I am and how that changes my own perception of who I see myself as. And then I started thinking about whether me even choosing that conclusion is something that is good or bad. And I really don't know how unique or I wouldn't say special, but different or separate this concept is, whether it's something that's very common or something that's, or like my specific experience of it is very distinctive. But regardless, it's something that I can't quite decide whether it's good or bad. On one hand, like ignorance is bliss, right? Someone who looks at everything for face value lives quite a peaceful life. But on the other hand, it can be pretty insightful and useful to be able to dive really deep into these types of things. So I'll give you an example. So let's say I'm walking downtown in a city and I see a homeless person sitting outside a pretty fancy restaurant just a few meters away. People are walking in and out, fancy clothes, suits, dresses, and there's soft jazz music coming from the speakers, and you can hear couples inside like laughing and tapping drinks and stuff like that. So imagine you're looking at the homeless person and you see them just laying down on the street, and you think to yourself, I feel bad for this person. I feel sorry for this person. And a simpler train of thought would probably end right there. Maybe you'd consider buying the meal for them or buying a meal for them or helping them find a better spot to sleep for the night. But ultimately, like that train of thought would pretty much end there. Instead, however, me personally, I would probably start analyzing the entire situation. I mean, this person is close to a restaurant, so they're probably looking for food, maybe leftovers or food scraps for the night. And it's a fancy restaurant, so maybe they're hoping that the people here are a little bit more generous, more giving. They might help them out. Um, then I might start thinking about like, how did this person even end up in this situation? There's hundreds or thousands of paths that people take in their lives, and I started thinking about like how this person might have ended up in this situation on the street outside a restaurant at this time while I'm here. Um, and then after all of this, I would think, yeah, I do. I feel bad for this person. But the problem is, it doesn't end there. Then I would keep going. I would start to analyze the thought of even feeling bad for them. Does it make me a good person to feel bad for them? I mean, if I feel bad for someone, if I see someone struggling, understanding that struggle to some capacity and sympathizing with them, surely that makes me a good person. But would a good person even think to consider themselves a good person in the first place? And that whole spiral is kind of what consumes my mind every time I step into these these very deep thought sessions and overthinking sessions. And before I know it, I've spent a couple minutes on what could have been just like a simple passing thought, something that should have been something that should have been like really short, and just something that crosses my mind turns into like an entire therapy session. And the thing is, I don't really know if this is bad or not. I mean, it allows me to consider what thoughts I'm actually having and whether those thoughts are good for me or not. And, a lot of people preach that if you want to become a newer or better version of yourself, you should just start acting like that better version of yourself. So, for example, if you want to be someone that's more friendly or outgoing, you might try to emulate an action of that type of person. So, you'd probably start smiling at strangers more often in public, or making more small talk in lines, or going to places where the chances of meeting someone are particularly high. So, if you can act like a person you want to be like, can you also think like the person you want to be like? So, can I, like, if I want to be a non judgmental and kind person, can I try changing my thoughts in real time to try to avoid judging people or be more sympathetic towards people in real time? Ultimately, I know that these thoughts are not who I am. They're always like temptations and intrusive thoughts that are not necessarily mine and have kind of been subverted into my mind through my upbringing and environment growing up, and even everyday day to day life. And these thoughts are not who I am as a person. They're not what makes me me. And that also brings me to another thing. Oftentimes, I'll find myself holding certain beliefs or biases that I can't quite identify the source of, or even if those thoughts are actually what I truly believe deep down, they're kind of just thoughts or beliefs that I've just always had and never thought to question them. And there's so many of these beliefs that are integrated into, everyone's minds, from growing up online and seeing the same messages over and over and over again, to the point that it forms almost our entire cognitive landscape. And some of these beliefs can be so small and simple, but at the same time be extremely poisonous in the long term because we never truly think to question them. At the end of the day, there's no limit to how much someone can think. Like, this entire video is just an entire collection of thoughts being spoken out loud to a camera. And ultimately, I'm not trying to be a philosopher or psychologist, but rather I just want to be able to identify my thoughts without immediately making judgments on them, or falling down spirals, and just being able to question where these thoughts come from, how they benefit me, and whether they're worth keeping or not. Thank you for listening. Good night.